to another episode of A Push with Lennox. And today we're going to talk about the Civil War. Now, I'm not going to get into a whole lot of depth with regards to battles and generals and stuff like that. But what we are going to cover is some of the big ideas, the political ideas behind it, the economic effects of it, and generally what both the North and South had to deal with during this time. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. And as we start, let me remind you that the Civil War went from 1861 to 1865. It started on April 11th and ended on April 9th. So we were literally 2 days from this being an exact 4-year war. But for intensive purposes, we're going to say the war lasted for 4 years. Now, as I've always told you guys, I want you to know the history language going into it. So this is the language of the Civil War. These are the terms you need to know. So go through this list, find those terms that you are familiar with and those you aren't. And if you're not familiar with all the terms, go ahead, jot down the ones you don't know. And as I go through this lecture, you can go ahead and write those definitions, okay? But let's go ahead and get started. The very first battle of the Civil War is going to be at Fort Sumter. Now, when Lincoln was elected in his first inaugural address, he basically said, I want no interference with slavery at all. Where it exists now, that's where it's going to be able to stay. However, remember the Republican platform in 1861 was to stop the expansion of slavery. On top of that, Lincoln said, you guys in the South, you ain't got no right to secede because we're all part of this constitutional republic. Well, the South, remember, was going on that compact theory that we've talked about in the past. And if you're not familiar with compact theory, just realize that the southern states believed they could leave the Union whenever they wanted if they felt like the government was not protecting them. Now, Lincoln's going to go about business as usual, and Fort Sumter, which was located in South Carolina, needs supplies. So he's going to refurbish the fort, and when that happens, the Confederate Army takes that as the United States encroaching upon Confederate land. And so they're going to attack Fort Sumter, and they're actually going to win that battle. Now, when that happens, people in the North are going to start to unite around the Army and the North and the fight against the Confederacy. In the South, same thing's going to happen. People are choosing up sides. Now, 4 states were kind of, on the fence whether or not to stay with the Confederacy or stay with, or go with the Union. All 4 of these states are slave-holding states. And it was Lincoln's primary priority to keep those states in the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. These are the border states. And the reason why, number one, if those states went into the Confederacy, that's more men from those states who could fight with the Confederacy. There were manufacturing factories in these states, and that would have assisted the South because there was no manufacturing in the South at all. And strategically, it was very important, especially Maryland. If you think about it, Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, lies right between Maryland and Virginia. Should Maryland go to the Confederacy, that meant our nation's capital was already starting off the war in the middle of enemy territory. So keeping those states is going to be a priority. And I should point out that those states are going to eventually stay with the Union, and they'll be able to keep their slaves. Going into the war, the North, they had some advantages and disadvantages. Number one was industry. I already mentioned manufacturing. They also had good infrastructure, transportation, primarily the railroads. So they could get, things across their area much easier than they could in the South. They had an established Navy, and what you'll find is Lincoln is going to use that Navy right away by trying to create a blockade of southern states. Their government was established. It was already in place. The South is going to be trying to build a government, from the beginning. Much more in the numbers of population, that's going to be advantage to the North. And then eventually by 1863, the idea of emancipation is going to be a huge advantage to the North. At the same time, they had their difficulties. Lack of leadership. While the North had a military, most of their strong leadership went to the South. They stayed with the southern states. And we're going to see in the beginning of the war throughout up until about 1862, 1863, Lincoln's trying to find a good commanding general. He doesn't have General Grant right away. So that's going to take time. And then in all honesty, they didn't have a reason to fight. There was that lack of purpose. And if you don't have a purpose, it's hard to keep people engaged. The South, though, their advantages, number one, they just have to defend. They have it's a defensive war. If the North never chooses to invade, the South is fine with that. They don't have to go into the North. They have a purpose for what they're fighting for. They felt that Lincoln and the Republicans were a threat to their way of life. So that's what they're fighting for, to defend their way of life. And that included slavery. They had very strong leadership in the military. I already mentioned that. And then they also relied on this idea of cotton diplomacy. The South had been the primary supplier of cotton in the world. And they assumed that going into this war, that the international marketplace would help support them, meaning they would keep supplying cotton to the world, and that would help fund this war and economically keep them going. They didn't have a navy, though. Their government, like I said, was being built as we went. So their government was pretty weak. And here's the other thing. Their government was built on something very similar to the Articles of Confederation. Not much power to the central government, a lot of power to the state governments. And that's going to make it very difficult, just like it was difficult for the United States in the very beginning. They had a very weak economy, and because of that, they had very little infrastructure, hardly any railroads, which is going to make it very difficult when they want to resupply their troops. And then no manufacturing. They were reliant on Europeans. They were reliant on the North to manufacture their cotton. So that's going to make it difficult as well. When it came time to fight, the United States under Lincoln is going to pass the Conscription Act. Now, this is one of the first drafts that we're going to use in our history. This was passed in March of 1863. The problem with the draft is what the Union Army just wanted was numbers. They didn't care who responded to the draft notice. This will give rise to what's known as the $300 men. These were men, typically, economically poor, who could be paid $300 to go fight in someone else's place. This idea of being able to sell your draft notice to somebody else is going to lead to the draft riots in 1863 in New York. The draft riots were basically what they sounded like. It was a mob of Irish Americans primarily who were rioting against wealthy Americans as well as African Americans, those free African Americans in New York, because they felt like due to their economic circumstances, they were the ones who were being forced to fight this war, even though they really didn't have a horse in the race. They just wanted to get by. But because there were no jobs for them, because up until this point, Irish Americans had been discriminated against for jobs and everything, this was their only opportunity to make money for their family. And this is going to lead to tension, and this is going to lead to the draft riots in 63. Lincoln is going to make a liberal use of executive power during this war. Typically, when we have times of crisis in America, we seem to see our civil liberties start to disappear. So the national crisis weighs more than our civil liberties. And there was no different in the Civil War. One of the very first things Lincoln does is he's going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus for people in Maryland. And what that does is that means you can be arrested without knowing what you've been charged with. You can just be thrown in jail, and there is no due process. There is no charges levied against you. You're just there. Lincoln did that in Maryland and other places to try to manipulate the vote on those states, whether they're going to secede or not secede. In Maryland, he had a lot of people who he believed or they believed would support secession, had them thrown in jail. And when the time came to vote, secession was voted down. That's one way that Lincoln kept the border states in the Union. He also is going to order that naval blockade that I mentioned earlier, as well as increasing the size of the federal army, both without congressional authority. Now, Lincoln had the authority to call Congress into session to make these decisions because Congress wasn't even in session until July of 1861. And this is happening in April and May of 1861. And though he had the power, he didn't call them back into session. So he's acting independently. And by means of the Constitution, he didn't have this authority. What's going to happen is Congress is going to approve some of these actions retroactively when they come back into session. One of the biggest things, biggest ideas that's passed by Lincoln, executive order, is going to be the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, by 1863, Lincoln's views had changed. It's no longer about stopping the spread of slavery. He's now thinking we have to bring slavery to an end. And so when he passes the Emancipation Proclamation, he has two primary goals. Number one, to strengthen his military. In doing this, what's going to happen is as slaves are freed, they're going to be free to join the military, and that's going to, give him more manpower. It's also going to be an economic attack on the South. They are reliant economically on those slaves, and as slaves are freed, that's going to hurt the South economically. But I think the bigger reason for the Emancipation Proclamation was an ideological reason. He's giving the people in the North, he's giving his army a cause to fight for. Remember, that was one of their weaknesses at the beginning of the war. They didn't have something to fight for. Now they do. Now, he's going to be pushed by radical Republicans. They're the ones who want this, but he's actually going to invoke the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order, January 1st, 1863. Also during this time, we're going to see the Confiscation and the Second Confiscation Act passed. This is going to give the military the power to not only release the slaves as they go into the South, because remember, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anybody. It was just on the books. So as this Northern Army made their way south, as they, took over territories, they were able to liberate slaves during that time. Now, the Confiscation Act is going to kind of back up the Emancipation Proclamation, saying that any slaves that are used for insurrectionary or are used against the Union in the war are automatically declared free. And the Second Confiscation Act is going to say any freed slaves who were basically taken into slavery to fight against the Union, which it did happen at times, were also going to be made free. So there are some laws. I mean, while the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order, some laws are going to be passed to help back that up. The Emancipation Proclamation, when it's passed, when it's signed, it's right after the Battle of Antietam. This is the one battle you really need to know. The Battle of Antietam is going to take place, and it was really fought to a draw. Although both the North and the South claimed victory, the North probably did win this war. And what's going to happen is this is going to give military justification for Lincoln to actually invoke the Emancipation Proclamation. Up to this point, the North wasn't doing too well. This is kind of a turning point in the war for several reasons. Number one, the South didn't win this battle. Number two, it's going to lead to the Emancipation Proclamation. And while that's signed, like I said, it doesn't free anybody, not even in the border states. The border states are allowed to keep their slaves until the 13th Amendment is passed in 1865. Here's the big turning point. Here's the big effect that makes the Emancipation or Antietam a major turning point. When the South didn't win, and when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, Europe chooses to stay completely out of this war. And once Europe says we're not going to get involved, the South is going to start going downhill for them very quickly. Because remember, they were hoping under cotton diplomacy to have that economic support from Europe, and it's just not going to happen. Also, as slaves are emancipated, they are going to, gain new. They're going to join the military. Some of them are going to actually enlist in the military, and I'll tell you why here in just a minute. But keep in mind, just overview. Again, I've said it a couple times. While the Emancipation Proclamation declared all slaves free, the North had no legal authority in the Confederate States. So really, not one slave was freed from the Emancipation Proclamation, but they were all freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. I hope that makes sense. So like I said, African Americans are going to start fighting in this war, especially as they gain their freedom. Frederick Douglass is going to push this idea for African Americans to enlist in the Union Army because that will be proof of their citizenship. We're going to see over 180,000 African Americans fight for the Union in the war. The most famous unit is going to be the Massachusetts 54th. They're going to fight in the Battle of Fort Wagner. A movie came out about them called Glory. Fantastic movie. If you get a chance, you got to watch that. But it wasn't like they were just welcomed into the Union Army. There was still a lot of discrimination because they were paid less than white soldiers, pretty much about half of what white soldiers made. So don't think that emancipation or African Americans entering into the war or anything like that is going to be bring some levity to discrimination and racism. It doesn't at all, but it's progress, it's movement towards, the lack of, or, the end of discrimination, towards the end of racism, stuff like that. During the war, there were a lot of challenges for both sides. Lincoln had to deal with both radical Republicans and moderates. The radical Republicans, they wanted to get in there and just destroy the South, whereas the moderates wanted to look for a peaceful solution to everything. A couple different groups of Democrats. While Lincoln, was a Republican and the radical and moderate Republicans pretty much controlled the Congress, there were Democrats. You had the war Democrats who supported the war, but were very critical with how Lincoln ran it. Copperheads were Democrats who actually opposed the war and, like the moderates, wanted to negotiate peace. The biggest challenge Lincoln's going to face is going to be the election of 1864, when he is going to run against General McClellan, who had been his commanding general not once, but twice, and was fired by Lincoln not once, but twice. McClellan is actually going to run on the idea that he's going to end the war by just going back to the way things were. Just call it a draw. Everybody go home. Keep your slaves. We're just going to go back to the way it was before the war. Now, obviously, Lincoln's going to win, but it was a very close election. The Confederacy, we've talked about it. Cotton diplomacy failed. And so that's going to be the biggest, dagger to the Southern economy. And then this idea of states' rights, the way they set up their government, it was very difficult to fight as individual states with a very weak central government. And that's what the Confederacy is going to face during this time. Now, the Republicans in Congress, they're going to take advantage of not having any pushback from, the South or other, a lot of Democrats, because there just weren't that many. And they're going to pass a number of legislative acts. In 1861, the Morrill Tariff Act is going to establish land for A&M universities in our country. 1862 is the Homestead Act, which is going to grant 360-acre homesteads for Americans as they move west. 1862 is the Legal Tender Act, which gives the government the power to print greenback dollars for the Union. 1863, the National Bank Act, that tried to unify the banking system within the United States. And then finally, I think the big one, 1863, the Pacific Railway Act, that's going to establish the route and the funding for the Transcontinental Railroad. And they're actually going to start building the Transcontinental Railroad during the Civil War. The impact of the Civil War, well, we know who won. The Union's going to win this. And what we're going to see is nearly 700,000 lives will be lost. They used to say around 600,000. That number seems to grow as time goes on, as we get more records. The Southern economy is going to be absolutely destroyed. And if it wasn't just the economy that was destroyed, a lot of the land was destroyed. Go and look up Sherman's March to the Sea and see how he used total war to completely destroy Southern lands. The Republican legislation that I already talked about. The Union victory also brought an end to the discussion of secession and nullification in our country. You've never heard talk of it ever since that time. And finally, here's the big one. Over 4 million slaves will be freed by the 13th Amendment, which will be passed in 1865. 13th Amendment is going to abolish slavery in our country. Now, into the Reconstruction era, it will be followed by the 14th and 15th Amendment, which will grant citizenship to freed African Americans as well as the right to vote. But we'll talk more about that in a later video. So that's it. That's a brief, up-to-date, view of the Civil War from 1861 to 1665. Have any questions? Just post them below. I thank you for listening, and you guys have a great day. Bye-bye.